August 12, 30 BC, Alexandria, Egypt. A woman who commanded the loyalty of millions, who seduced the two most powerful men in Rome, who held the fate of the ancient world in her hands, lay dying in a locked room, and for over 2,000 years, we've been told she killed herself with the bite of an asp. A cobra smuggled past Roman guards in a basket of figs. But what if almost everything you know about Cleopatra's death is a lie? What if the snake never existed? What if she didn't kill herself at all? What if the greatest mystery in ancient history has been hiding in plain sight, covered up by Roman propaganda that we've accepted as truth for millennia? The room was sealed from the inside. Two of her most trusted handmaidens lay dead beside her. Octavian's guards broke down the door to find Egypt's last pharaoh already cold. No snake was ever found. No bite marks were confirmed, and the timeline makes absolutely no sense. Yet this story, this convenient narrative of a desperate queen taking her own life in dramatic fashion, has persisted for 2,000 years, but recent archaeological discoveries, forensic analysis, and a careful examination of the ancient sources reveal something far more sinister, far more political, and far more believable than the myth we've been taught. Because Cleopatra wasn't just any ruler. She was the richest woman in the ancient world, controlling Egypt's vast grain supplies that fed Rome itself. She was a military strategist who nearly changed the course of Western civilization. She was a polyglot who spoke 9 languages, a skilled diplomat who negotiated with kings and generals, a mother desperately trying to secure her children's future. And on that August night in 30 BCE, she stood between Octavian and absolute power over the Roman world. So before we unravel what really happened in that locked room, we need to understand who Cleopatra actually was. Not the seductress of Hollywood films, not the exotic temptress of Renaissance paintings, but the calculating political genius who terrified Rome more than any foreign enemy ever had. Cleopatra VII Philopator was born in 69 BCE into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek royal family that had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries since Alexander the Great's general Ptolemy I seized power after Alexander's death. And here's the first thing Hollywood gets wrong. Cleopatra wasn't Egyptian in the ethnic sense. She was Macedonian Greek, but she was the first of her dynasty in nearly 300 years who actually bothered to learn the Egyptian language, who participated in Egyptian religious ceremonies, who presented herself as the living embodiment of the goddess Isis. And this wasn't just political theater. This was strategic brilliance, because while her ancestors ruled Egypt as foreign overlords, speaking only Greek and living in isolated luxury in Alexandria, Cleopatra understood that true power came from the genuine loyalty of her people, not just the fear of her armies. She ascended to the throne at 17 or 18 years old in 51 BCE, sharing power with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII in the tradition of Ptolemaic incestuous co-rule, and immediately she faced a crisis that would have destroyed a lesser ruler. Egypt was broke, the Nile floods had failed for years, famine gripped the land, her father had borrowed vast sums from Roman moneylenders to maintain his throne, and Rome, the great superpower of the Mediterranean, was circling like a vulture, waiting for any excuse to annex the richest prize in the ancient world, Egypt's grain fields that produced 1/3 of Rome's food supply, its gold mines, its strategic position controlling trade routes to Africa, Arabia, and India, and most of all, its legendary wealth accumulated over 3,000 years of pharaonic civilization. Within 3 years, her brother's advisors, seeing her as a threat to their own power, staged a coup and drove Cleopatra out of Alexandria, forcing her to flee to Syria where she began raising an army to reclaim her throne. And this is where Julius Caesar enters the story, not as a conqueror, but as a man pursuing his rival Pompey the Great who had fled to Egypt after losing the Roman Civil War. And when Caesar arrived in Alexandria in 48 BCE, expecting to capture Pompey, he instead received the severed head of his enemy, murdered by Ptolemy XII's advisors who thought they were doing Caesar a favor. But Caesar was horrified, not because he cared about Pompey, but because these Egyptian advisors had dared to execute a Roman consul without Rome's permission. It was an insult to Roman dignity, and it gave Caesar the perfect excuse to stay in Egypt, to mediate the dispute between Cleopatra and her brother, to position himself as the arbiter of Egyptian affairs. What happened next has become legend. Cleopatra had herself smuggled past enemy lines, rolled up inside a carpet or possibly a large sack of bedding, accounts vary, and delivered directly to Caesar's quarters in the palace. And when the carpet was unrolled, there she stood, 21 years old, face to face with the 52-year-old conqueror of Gaul. But here's what the romantic legends miss. Cleopatra didn't seduce Caesar with her beauty. Ancient sources are actually quite clear that she wasn't considered a legendary beauty. Plutarch writes that her actual beauty was not in itself incomparable, nor such as to strike those who saw her, but her conversation had an irresistible charm, and the persuasiveness of her discourse, joined with her engaging manner, had something stimulating about it. What Cleopatra possessed was intelligence, wit, charisma, and most importantly, a proposal that made perfect strategic sense to Caesar. She offered him something no amount of Roman legions could simply take: legitimate rule over Egypt with the full support of its people, access to unlimited funding for his civil war against the remaining Pompeian forces, an alliance with a ruler who understood both Greek and Eastern politics, who could serve as Rome's bridge to the wealthy kingdoms of the East. Caesar agreed to support her claim. Roman troops fought alongside Cleopatra's forces against Ptolemy XIII, and in the resulting Battle of the Nile in 47 BCE, her brother drowned in the river, some say fleeing in panic, some say weighed down by his golden armor, and Cleopatra was restored to the throne, now ruling alongside her youngest brother Ptolemy XIV, a mere 12-year-old child who posed no threat to her authority. And within weeks she was pregnant with Caesar's child, a son she would name Caesarion, Ptolemy XV Caesar, deliberately linking her dynasty to Rome's greatest general, making her son the heir to both Egypt and potentially Rome itself. And this is what we need to understand about Cleopatra. Every move was calculated, every relationship served a purpose. She wasn't playing at politics. She was playing the greatest game of all, the survival of her dynasty and her nation in a world increasingly dominated by Roman power. For 3 years, Cleopatra lived in Rome as Caesar's guest, installing herself in his villa across the Tiber River, hosting lavish parties for Roman senators, commissioning a golden statue of herself dressed as Isis that Caesar placed in the temple of Venus Genetrix, and scandalizing Roman society with her foreign ways, her Egyptian religion, her undeniable influence over the dictator. And Romans whispered that Caesar planned to make himself king, to move the capital to Alexandria, to marry Cleopatra despite Roman law forbidding marriage to foreigners, to make Caesarion his heir instead of his great-nephew Octavian. And whether these rumors were true or not, they terrified the Roman Senate enough that on March 15, 44 BCE, the Ides of March, 60 senators stabbed Julius Caesar to death on the floor of the Senate House, 23 knife wounds, betrayed by men he considered friends, murdered in the name of preserving the Republic. And Cleopatra, 9 months pregnant with Caesar's child, fled Rome immediately, returning to Alexandria and the only place where she still held absolute power. But Caesar's assassination didn't end Rome's civil wars. It ignited them. The conspirators, led by Brutus and Cassius, controlled the east. Caesar's loyal generals Mark Antony and Lepidus controlled the west. Young Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, only 18 years old, claimed his inheritance and demanded a share of power. And Egypt, wealthy, neutral, essential to whoever would ultimately win, became the prize they all courted. And Cleopatra, now 29 years old, ruling alone after conveniently arranging the death of her brother husband Ptolemy XIV, had to choose which side to support, knowing that choosing wrong meant the end of her dynasty, the annexation of Egypt, and the death of her son Caesarion, the only living child of Julius Caesar, the boy who represented both the legitimacy of her rule and the greatest threat to anyone who wanted to consolidate power in Rome. In 41 BCE, Mark Antony, having defeated the assassins at Philippi and taken control of Rome's eastern provinces, summoned Cleopatra to meet him in Tarsus in modern-day Turkey, to answer charges that she had supported Brutus and Cassius and Cleopatra. Understanding theater and power as well as anyone in the ancient world, didn't simply show up, she arrived in a spectacle that would be remembered for centuries. Sailing up the river Cydnus in a barge with gilded stern, purple sails, silver oars, that moved in time to flutes and pipes and harps, dressed as the goddess Venus, surrounded by attendants dressed as sea nymphs and graces, with incense burning and creating clouds of perfume that spread across the river. And when she finally granted Antony an audience, the message was clear. I am not some provincial governor you can summon. I am the Queen of Egypt, the embodiment of divine power, the richest woman in the world, and you need me far more than I need you. Antony was 42 years old, a brilliant general, Caesar's most loyal deputy, a man who enjoyed wine, women, and the pleasures of life, and unlike Caesar who had been calculating and controlled, Antony fell genuinely, completely, disastrously in love with Cleopatra, and she saw in him not just a military ally but possibly something more, a partner, a co-ruler, someone who understood power and pleasure in equal measure, who could appreciate her intelligence and ambition, who could help her fulfill her ultimate dream, not just to preserve Egypt's independence, but to create a new empire spanning east and west, with her children as its heirs, with Alexandria, not Rome, as its capital, with Egyptian and Hellenistic culture, not Roman militarism, as its foundation. For the next decade, Antony and Cleopatra's relationship would define the politics of the ancient world. He spent winters in Alexandria, living in opulent luxury, fathering 3 children with her, twins named Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene in 40 BCE, and another son, Ptolemy Philadelphus in 36 BCE, and together they styled themselves as divine rulers, Antony as the new Dionysus, god of wine and revelry, Cleopatra as the new Isis, mother goddess of Egypt, and they held elaborate ceremonies where they divided up the eastern Roman provinces among their children, declaring Caesarion as king of kings, Alexander Helios as ruler of Armenia, Media, and Parthia, Cleopatra Selene as queen of Cyrenaica and Libya, Ptolemy Philadelphus as ruler of Syria and Cilicia, essentially announcing that they intended to rule the East as an independent power separate from Rome. And if this wasn't enough to enrage the Roman Senate, Antony divorced his Roman wife Octavia, who happened to be Octavian's beloved sister, the one political marriage that had kept the peace between Antony and Octavian for years, and Octavian, patient, calculating, only 29 years old but already a master of propaganda, seized his opportunity. Octavian launched a propaganda campaign so effective that it still shapes how we view Cleopatra today. He declared that Antony had been bewitched by an evil foreign seductress, that Cleopatra had used drugs and magic to cloud his mind, that she was a drunken whore who performed sexual acts with slaves for entertainment, that she planned to rule Rome from Egypt, to make Romans slaves of Oriental despotism, that she wanted to move the capital to Alexandria and declare herself Queen of Rome. And, most effectively, Octavian framed the coming conflict not as a Roman civil war, not as Octavian versus Antony, but as Rome versus Egypt, civilization versus barbarism, Roman virtue versus Egyptian decadence. And when he finally declared war in 32 BCE, he declared it not against Antony, his fellow Roman, but against Cleopatra alone, making her the enemy of Rome, the foreign threat that all Romans could unite against. The decisive battle came on September 2, 31 BCE at Actium, off the western coast of Greece, where Antony and Cleopatra's combined fleet of 230 ships faced Octavian's 400 vessels commanded by his brilliant Admiral Agrippa, and what happened next has been debated for 2 millennia. In the middle of the battle, with the outcome still uncertain, Cleopatra's squadron of 60 Egyptian ships suddenly broke away and fled south toward Egypt, and Antony, seeing his lover's ships departing, abandoned his own fleet and followed her in a single ship, leaving his navy and army leaderless, and without their commanders. Antony's forces collapsed, some ships were sunk, others surrendered, the soldiers on shore, demoralized and confused, eventually joined Octavian's side, and the Battle of Actium was over. But why did Cleopatra retreat? Roman sources claim she panicked, that her feminine weakness betrayed Antony at the crucial moment, but modern historians suggest something more strategic. She may have recognized the battle was lost and chose to preserve her fleet and treasury for a last defense of Egypt itself. She may have been following a prearranged plan to break through Octavian's blockade while Antony distracted the enemy fleet. Or she may have received false intelligence that Antony was already dead or defeated. Regardless, the result was catastrophic. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Alexandria with Octavian pursuing. Their alliance with Eastern kings crumbled. Their armies deserted. Their options narrowed to surrender or death. For nearly a year, Octavian methodically advanced on Egypt while Antony and Cleopatra frantically tried to negotiate, to bribe, to find some way to survive. Cleopatra sent messages to Octavian offering to abdicate in favor of her children. Antony sent messages offering to retire to private life in Egypt or Athens. But Octavian's response was always the same. Cleopatra must surrender unconditionally, Antony must die, and Cleopatra's children would be spared only if she personally delivered Antony's head. And this is where we begin to see Cleopatra's desperation. She started testing various poisons on condemned prisoners, observing their effects, searching for a method of death that would be quick and painless. She had a mausoleum built near the Temple of Isis, a fortified tomb where she moved Egypt's treasure, all the gold and silver and precious jewels accumulated over millennia, along with great quantities of wood and incense. And she let it be known that if Octavian attacked, she would burn herself and all of Egypt's wealth together, denying him his prize. And this threat, the threat of destroying the very treasure that Octavian needed to pay his troops and stabilize Rome's economy, was the only leverage she had left. In late July of 30 BCE, Octavian's forces reached Alexandria, and on August 1st, Antony led his remaining cavalry against Octavian's advance guard in a last desperate attempt to hold the city. And for one day, for one brief shining moment, his old military skill returned. He drove back the Romans, won a small victory, returned to the palace and embraced Cleopatra still in his armor, kissing her and presenting one of his soldiers who had fought with particular bravery. And Cleopatra rewarded this soldier with a golden breastplate and helmet, magnificent gifts, and that night, the soldier deserted to Octavian, taking his golden gifts with him. And the next morning, when Antony led his forces out again, his fleet and cavalry surrendered without fighting. Whole units simply joined Octavian's side, and Antony realized that he had been utterly betrayed, that there was no hope left, that Cleopatra had probably been negotiating secretly with Octavian all along. And in his rage and despair, he stumbled back to the palace shouting that Cleopatra had betrayed him to the Romans. Cleopatra, hearing that Antony blamed her for the defeat, fearing his rage, or perhaps executing a pre-planned stratagem, fled to her mausoleum with her two most loyal handmaidens, Iris and Charmian, sealed herself inside, and sent a message to Antony that she was dead, that she had killed herself, that her last words were of her love for him. And Antony, receiving this news, was devastated. All his rage dissolved into grief. He called for his servant Eros, asked him to strike the fatal blow, rather than force Antony to do it himself. But Eros instead drew his sword and killed himself, and Antony, shamed by his servant's courage, took his own sword and stabbed himself in the stomach, a traditional Roman suicide, falling on his sword, but he bungled it. The wound was not immediately fatal. He lay there bleeding, calling out for someone to finish the job, to end his suffering, and then word arrived that Cleopatra wasn't actually dead. She was alive in her mausoleum, and Antony, bleeding from his self-inflicted wound, begged to be carried to her. The doors of the mausoleum couldn't be opened. Cleopatra refused to unlock them, fearing Octavian's troops might rush in. So Antony had to be hoisted up through a window by ropes, bleeding, dying, pulled up by Cleopatra and her two handmaidens, and he died in her arms in that sealed tomb, surrounded by Egypt's treasure, and Cleopatra, according to sources, tore at her clothes, beat her breasts, smeared his blood on her face, called him her lord, her husband, her emperor. But even in this moment of genuine grief, she was calculating, she was thinking of her children, of how to negotiate with Octavian, of how to survive the impossible, because as long as she lived, as long as she controlled Egypt's treasure, she had value, she had leverage, she had hope. Octavian received news of Antony's death with what the sources call satisfaction. But when he sent messengers to Cleopatra demanding she surrender, she refused. She remained barricaded in her mausoleum with her treasure, still threatening to burn it all, and Octavian faced a dilemma. He needed that treasure desperately. His troops were on the verge of mutiny, demanding the bonuses he had promised them. Rome itself was nearly bankrupt after 2 decades of civil war. Egypt's wealth was supposed to solve all his problems, but if Cleopatra burned it, if she followed through on her threat, he would have conquered Egypt and gained nothing but a smoking ruin. So he sent his most trusted advisor, Gaius Proculius, to negotiate, to promise anything, to lie if necessary, to keep Cleopatra alive and keep her away from matches and kindling long enough for him to seize the treasure. Proculius approached the mausoleum, spoke to Cleopatra through the sealed doors, promised that Octavian would be merciful, that her children would be spared, that she could keep her dignity and her kingdom if she just surrendered peacefully. And while he kept her distracted with these negotiations, Roman soldiers crept around the back of the building, climbed up ladders, entered through the same window where Antony had been hoisted up, and suddenly grabbed Cleopatra from behind before she could reach the dagger she kept with her, before she could stab herself, before she could set fire to the treasure, and Octavian had her, alive, his prisoner, and all of Egypt's wealth secured. But she wasn't finished fighting, not yet. Cleopatra was 39 years old. She had ruled Egypt for 21 years. She had been lover to 2 of the 3 most powerful men in Rome. She had borne 4 children. She had commanded fleets and armies. She had held the fate of the ancient world in her hands. And now she was Octavian's prisoner, held under guard in her own palace while Octavian decided what to do with her. And the Roman general faced his own dilemma. If he killed her outright, he would be seen as a tyrant murdering a defeated queen. But if he let her live in Egypt, she might rally supporters, might escape, might somehow continue to be a threat. So he decided on a third option. He would take her to Rome, display her in his triumph, parade her through the streets in chains as the ultimate symbol of Rome's victory over Egypt. The humiliation of the proud queen would be the centerpiece of his propaganda victory. And then, after the triumph, he could quietly execute her or let her live in disgrace. It didn't matter which, her power would be broken forever. But Cleopatra understood what awaited her. She had been in Rome during Caesar's triumphs. She had seen how conquered rulers were displayed, chained, mocked, paraded before jeering crowds, sometimes strangled in the Tullianum prison immediately after the triumph. And she knew that Octavian planned to make an example of her, to use her humiliation to legitimize his own power, and she could not, would not, allow herself to be turned into a prop in a Roman victory parade. She would die as a queen of Egypt, not as Octavian's trophy. But she couldn't simply refuse to go to Rome. She was under constant guard, watched every moment. How could she possibly take her own life? This is where the story enters its final act, the mystery that has consumed historians for 2,000 years, because what happened next, in the days between her capture and her death, depends entirely on which source you trust. And every source was written by Romans, by the victors, by people who had every reason to shape the narrative in ways that served Rome's interests, that justified Octavian's actions, that turned Cleopatra into a cautionary tale about the dangers of foreign influence. According to Plutarch, writing a century and a half after the events, Cleopatra made a final request to Octavian. She asked to be allowed to visit Antony's tomb to make offerings to properly mourn, and Octavian, confident that she was now broken and defeated, agreed. She was escorted under guard to Antony's tomb, poured libations, placed flowers, wept, and according to Plutarch, prayed to the gods that since she had failed in life, they might at least not separate her from Antony in death. And then she returned to the palace, bathed, dressed in her finest royal regalia, and ordered a magnificent feast. And during this feast, according to the famous story, a farmer arrived at the palace gates carrying a basket of figs. The guards inspected the basket, saw only figs, and allowed it through, and inside that basket, hidden beneath the figs, was an ASP, an Egyptian cobra, and Cleopatra. After eating and writing final letters, including one to Octavian asking to be buried alongside, Antony held the snake to her breast or her arm, accounts vary, and allowed it to bite her, and the venom killed her quickly, painlessly, and when Octavian's guards broke down the door, they found Cleopatra dead on a golden couch, dressed in her royal regalia, with her two handmaidens Iris and Charmian also dead or dying beside her. And when asked what happened, Charmian supposedly said with her last breath, "It is well done, and fitting for a princess descended from so many royal kings." And then she too died, and that's the story, that's the legend, the suicide by cobra that has been depicted in countless paintings, plays, poems, and films. But here's the problem, almost none of it makes sense. First, the snake itself, an ASP, is supposedly an Egyptian cobra, but Egyptian cobras don't behave the way the story requires. They're aggressive when threatened but not particularly inclined to bite on command. They're also fairly large snakes, 2 to 3 meters long, far too large to hide in a basket of figs without being immediately obvious, and their venom, while deadly, doesn't work the way Plutarch describes. Cobra venom is neurotoxic. It causes progressive paralysis, difficulty breathing, eventual respiratory failure. The victim remains conscious for some time, experiencing tingling, numbness, difficulty swallowing, progressive weakness, and death takes anywhere from 30 minutes to several hours. It's not quick, it's not painless, and it definitely doesn't allow someone to arrange themselves peacefully on a couch looking serene. Victims of cobra bites typically experience violent convulsions, vomiting, loss of bladder control, not the dignified death described in the sources. And furthermore, how did all 3 women die from the same snake bite? Did they pass the cobra around? Did it obediently bite 3 times? And where did the snake go? No snake was ever found in the room, despite intensive searches by Octavian's guards. Some sources suggest it slithered away, but the room was sealed from the inside. How did a 2-meter cobra escape from a locked room? Second, the timeline makes no sense. According to the sources, Cleopatra wrote a letter to Octavian, sealed it, sent it with a messenger, and by the time Octavian read it, understood that it was a suicide note, and sent guards running to the palace, she was already dead. But Octavian's headquarters were not in the palace, they were in the city. A messenger would have taken at least 15 or 20 minutes to deliver the letter. Octavian would have needed time to read it, comprehend it, and issue orders. The guards would have needed time to rush to the palace and break down the door. We're talking at minimum 30 to 40 minutes, probably longer. But if Cleopatra was bitten by a cobra when she sealed that letter, she would have been alive, conscious, suffering increasingly severe symptoms when the guards arrived, not peacefully dead and arranged on her couch. Third, the behavior doesn't match Cleopatra's demonstrated personality. This was a woman who spent weeks testing poisons on condemned prisoners, carefully observing their effects, searching for a method of death that would be reliable, painless, and quick. Would she really trust her death, the most important moment of her life, the final act that would define her legacy, to an unpredictable wild animal that might not bite, might not inject enough venom, might cause a slow, agonizing death instead of the peaceful end she desired? It makes no sense. Cleopatra was nothing if not thorough, calculating, controlled. The cobra suicide feels like the desperate improvisation of someone with no other options. But Cleopatra had been planning this contingency for months. She would have had a better plan. Fourth, consider who benefits from the snake story. Octavian desperately needed Cleopatra dead. She was too dangerous to leave alive, too politically valuable to other potential rivals, too capable of inspiring loyalty and rebellion. But he also needed her death to appear to be suicide. If she was murdered by Roman hands, she would become a martyr, a symbol of Egyptian resistance against Roman oppression. Her death might inspire rebellions throughout the East, and Octavian was trying to present himself as a legitimate ruler, not a tyrant who murdered defeated queens. So the snake story is perfect for him. It's dramatic, it's exotic, it has symbolic resonance because the cobra is associated with Egyptian royalty. The uraeus on the pharaoh's crown, it makes Cleopatra's death seem like her choice, a final act of defiance and dignity, and it completely absolves Octavian of any responsibility. He's not a murderer. He's simply the ruler who wasn't quite quick enough to prevent a clever queen from outsmarting his guards. How convenient. So if it wasn't a cobra, what really killed Cleopatra? The ancient sources actually preserve other theories that have been largely forgotten in favor of the dramatic snake story. Strabo, writing just a generation after the events, mentions that some people believe Cleopatra used a poisonous ointment that she applied to her body, or that she had a hollow hairpin or comb that contained poison, and several sources mention that Cleopatra had been testing various poisons extensively, and that she determined that a mixture of opium, hemlock, and wolfsbane, applied as an ointment or taken orally, could produce a death that appeared peaceful and painless. The victim would simply fall asleep and not wake up. No convulsions, no obvious signs of trauma, just a peaceful end. This makes far more sense with everything we know about Cleopatra. She would have prepared the poison herself, tested it, verified its effects, kept it hidden on her person or in her chambers where guards wouldn't find it. Perhaps in a cosmetic container, a perfume bottle, something innocuous. And when the moment came, when she knew Octavian planned to take her to Rome, she simply took the poison, arranged herself on her couch in her royal regalia, and died exactly as she had planned, with dignity, with control, on her own terms, and her handmaidens, loyal to the end, took the same poison, choosing to die with their queen rather than face Rome's vengeance or Octavian's interrogation. But there's an even darker possibility that some historians have considered. What if Cleopatra didn't kill herself at all? What if she was murdered on Octavian's orders? Consider the evidence. Cleopatra was the mother of Caesarion, Julius Caesar's only biological son, and as long as Caesarion lived, he represented a potential rival to Octavian who was merely Caesar's adopted heir. Octavian needed Caesarion dead, and in fact, shortly after Cleopatra's death, Caesarion, who had been sent away for safety, was lured back to Egypt with promises of mercy, and then quietly murdered. Octavian justified this by quoting Homer, "It is not good to have too many Caesars." So Octavian was clearly willing to murder children if they threatened his power. Would he hesitate to murder their mother? Cleopatra alive was dangerous. She could escape, she could rally supporters, she could reach out to Eastern kings who still respected her. She knew too much about Roman politics, about Caesar's plans, about the weaknesses and corruptions of Rome's leaders, and most importantly, parading her through Rome in a triumph was actually risky. She was charismatic, she was dignified. She might win sympathy from the Roman crowd. She might be more effective as a living symbol than as a defeated prisoner. So perhaps Octavian decided the safest option was to have her quietly killed and blame it on suicide. His guards could have held her down, forced poison down her throat or injected it, arranged her body peacefully on the couch, killed the handmaidens to eliminate witnesses, and then invented the entire snake story to cover up a political assassination. The fact that Octavian moved so quickly to have artists create images of Cleopatra with a cobra, the fact that he included a representation of her death in his triumph even though he didn't have her body to parade, the fact that the snake story became official almost immediately, all of this suggests a coordinated propaganda campaign, and propaganda campaigns require planning. They don't just spontaneously emerge. Someone had to decide what narrative would be most effective, what story would best serve Rome's interests, and that someone was almost certainly Octavian himself. There's also the question of the handmaidens. Why did Iras and Charmian die with Cleopatra? The romantic version suggests ultimate loyalty. They chose death with their queen over life without her. But consider the practical reality. These women knew everything. They knew Cleopatra's plans, her secrets, her communications with Octavian, her possible escape routes. They knew whether the suicide was genuine or whether something else happened. They were witnesses who could contradict the official story, and conveniently, they both died before anyone could interrogate them properly. Before. They could be separated and questioned individually, before inconsistencies in their stories could emerge, and the only words we have from Charmian. It is well done and fitting for a princess descended from so many royal kings. Come from Plutarch writing a century and a half later, not from any contemporary account, not from anyone who was actually in the room. How convenient that her last words perfectly support the suicide narrative, almost as if someone invented them specifically for that purpose. Modern forensic analysis of ancient deaths is obviously limited by the lack of physical evidence. Cleopatra's body was supposedly buried alongside Antony. The location of their tomb remains one of archaeology's great mysteries, possibly buried under Alexandria's modern city, possibly in Taposiris Magna where recent excavations have found tantalizing but inconclusive evidence, possibly destroyed or lost centuries ago. Without a body, without physical evidence, we can't perform toxicology tests, can't examine for trauma, can't definitively prove how she died, but we can analyze the historical sources, the political context, the forensic plausibility of various scenarios, and when we do that, the cobra story falls apart. It's too convenient, too symbolic, too perfectly suited to Roman propaganda needs, too inconsistent with what we know about cobra venom and Cleopatra's personality and the timeline of events. Some historians have suggested a middle ground. Perhaps Cleopatra did commit suicide, but used the poison she had been testing, not a cobra, and the snake story was added later by Roman historians who found it more dramatic and symbolically resonant. Plutarch admits he's not certain about the snake. He says some people claim to have seen 2 small puncture marks on her arm, but others found no marks at all. He's clearly uncertain, reporting rumors and legends rather than established facts. And yet this uncertain legend has become the definitive version of events, taught in schools, depicted in art, accepted as truth for 2 millennia. Why? Because it's a better story, because it fits our expectations of how a tragic queen should die, because it satisfies our desire for dramatic narrative closure, because it makes Cleopatra into a romantic figure rather than a political player. It domesticates her, turns her from a calculating strategic genius into an emotional woman who chose death for love, and this transformation serves the purposes of patriarchy and empire. It makes her less threatening, less admirable, less dangerous as an example to others. The truth is, we don't know exactly how Cleopatra died. We probably never will know with absolute certainty. The sources are contradictory. The physical evidence is lost. The entire event happened in a sealed room with no reliable witnesses except 2 handmaidens who immediately died themselves. What we do know is that Octavian had every reason to want her dead and every reason to shape the narrative of her death to serve his political purposes. We know that the cobra story has significant forensic problems and logical inconsistencies. We know that Cleopatra was brilliant, calculating, and obsessed with maintaining control and dignity even in death. We know that she had been researching poisons specifically to find a reliable method of suicide if needed. And we know that the winners write history, and Octavian was the ultimate winner. But here's what makes this story truly fascinating. Regardless of exactly how Cleopatra died, whether by cobra, by poison, or by assassination, her death accomplished something remarkable. It made her immortal, not in the way she wanted, not as the founder of a dynasty that would rule both East and West. Her children were either murdered or married off to foreign kings and disappeared from history. Caesarion was killed within weeks of her death. Alexander Helios vanished from historical records. Possibly dying young, Cleopatra Selene married King Juba II of Mauritania and lived a quiet life far from the centers of power, and Ptolemy Philadelphus simply disappears from history. We don't even know when or how he died, so Cleopatra's biological legacy failed completely. Her dynasty ended with her. Egypt became a Roman province. just another source of grain and gold for the empire, but her legend, her story, her image as the ultimate seductress. The queen who nearly changed the course of history. This survived, this thrived, this became more powerful than any kingdom she could have ruled. Octavian himself recognized this power after Cleopatra's death. He had statues of her removed from temples, had her name chiseled off monuments, tried to erase her from Egyptian history, but he couldn't completely destroy her memory because he needed her as a cautionary tale. He needed the story of the dangerous foreign queen who seduced Roman generals and nearly destroyed Rome. This story justified his own seizure of power. It explained why he had to eliminate Antony, why he had to take control of Egypt, why he had to become Augustus, Rome's first emperor. Because look what happens when weak men fall under the spell of ambitious foreign women. Look how close Rome came to disaster. Only the vigilant, the strong, the purely Roman like Octavian could save the Republic. Never mind that Octavian himself destroyed the Republic and established a monarchy. He did it by framing himself as the protector against threats like Cleopatra. And so Cleopatra became a symbol, endlessly reinterpreted through the ages. Medieval Christians saw her as a personification of lust and sin. Renaissance artists portrayed her as an exotic Oriental queen. Shakespeare made her the ultimate tragic heroine consumed by love. Hollywood turned her into Elizabeth Taylor in fabulous costumes. Feminist scholars reclaim her as a powerful female ruler destroyed by Roman patriarchy. And each generation recreates her according to their own values and fears and fantasies. But the real Cleopatra, the political genius who spoke 9 languages, who studied philosophy and mathematics, who commanded fleets and balanced the competing interests of Egypt and Rome for 2 decades, who nearly succeeded in creating a new world order with her children as its heirs. This Cleopatra often gets lost in the mythology. What the Cobra story does, whether it's true or not, is transform Cleopatra's death from a political event into a personal one. It makes her final act about love and despair rather than about strategy and control. It suggests she killed herself because Antony was dead and she couldn't bear to live without him. But this completely misunderstands who Cleopatra was. She had already been planning her suicide before Antony died. She had been testing poisons. She had been preparing her mausoleum, not because she was in love, but because she understood political reality. She knew that Octavian would never allow her to remain as Egypt's queen. She knew that her children's only hope of survival was if she removed herself as a threat. She knew that dying as a queen was preferable to living as Octavian's prisoner, and most importantly, she knew that controlling the manner of her death was the last power she possessed, the last choice she could make, the last way she could deny Octavian his complete victory. Think about what Octavian wanted. He wanted to parade her through Rome in chains, to display her defeat, to use her humiliation as proof of his triumph, to show the Roman people and the world that he had conquered the great seductress, the dangerous queen, the Eastern threat, and then, after his triumph, he would have her strangled or exiled or imprisoned. Her fate would be entirely in his hands. She would be powerless, and for a woman who had held absolute power for 21 years, who had treated with emperors as an equal, who had commanded the fate of nations, this loss of agency would have been worse than death. So by killing herself, whether with poison or cobra or whatever method she chose, Cleopatra denied Octavian the spectacle he craved. She robbed him of his trophy. She chose her own fate, and in doing so, she transformed her defeat into a kind of victory, not a military victory, not a political victory, but a personal moral victory. She died as a queen, in her palace, in her regalia, on her own terms, and Octavian was left with nothing but a corpse and a story he had to carefully manage. And this is why the method of death matters so much, because it determines how we interpret Cleopatra's agency. If she died by cobra in a desperate improvisation, she's a tragic figure who lost control at the end. If she died by carefully prepared poison in a calculated final act, she's a strategic genius who maintained control even in death. If she was murdered by Octavian's orders, she's a victim of Roman imperialism. not a protagonist in her own story, and each interpretation reflects different assumptions about power, gender, agency, and history. The Cobra story appeals to us because it's dramatic and romantic, but it also diminishes Cleopatra, turns her final act into something impulsive and emotional rather than calculated and strategic. And maybe that's exactly why the story has persisted, because it makes Cleopatra less threatening, less competent, less admirable as a political leader. Modern scholars analyzing the ancient sources have identified multiple layers of Roman propaganda in how Cleopatra was portrayed. Even during her lifetime, Roman historians and poets were writing about her as a dangerous seductress. Horace called her a mad queen plotting to destroy Rome. Propertius described her as a whore. Virgil depicted her in the Aeneid as a priestess of monstrous gods. And all of this propaganda was designed to justify Rome's war against her, to make Roman citizens support Octavian's campaign, to frame the civil war as a righteous conflict against foreign evil rather than as what it actually was, one Roman general fighting another for supreme power. And after her death, this propaganda only intensified. Octavian needed to explain why he had broken the Roman tradition against executing royal women, why he had allowed or caused Cleopatra's death. So the suicide story, particularly the Cobra version, served his purposes perfectly. It made her death her own choice, her own fault, the inevitable result of her own excessive passions and foreign decadence. But what if we strip away the propaganda? What if we look at Cleopatra's actions based on the indisputable historical record rather than on the stories Romans told about her? What we find is a ruler who came to power at 18 in a crisis situation and managed to maintain Egypt's independence for 2 decades in the face of Roman expansion, who understood that Egypt's only hope was to align with Rome's most powerful leaders, but to align as a partner, not a subject, who bore children to both Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, linking her dynasty to Rome's ruling class, ensuring her children would have claims to power in both Egypt and Rome, who studied poisons and warfare and diplomacy and finance, who spoke the languages of all the peoples she ruled and the powers she negotiated with, who commanded fleets at Actium and made strategic decisions about when to fight and when to preserve resources for future battles, who maintained the loyalty of her subjects even as her military position became impossible, who extracted better terms from Octavian through threats of destroying Egypt's treasure than she could have through military force, and who, at the very end, found a way to die that denied her enemy the satisfaction of total victory and ensured that she would be remembered not as Octavian's prisoner but as Egypt's last pharaoh who chose death over submission. This is not the story of a seductress who manipulated men with sexual wiles. This is the story of a political mastermind who used every tool available to her, including sexuality when appropriate but also intelligence, strategic alliance, economic leverage, military force, religious authority, and theatrical self-presentation, to maintain her power and protect her kingdom against the greatest military empire in the ancient world. And the fact that she ultimately failed doesn't diminish the brilliance of her strategies. It simply reflects the overwhelming superiority of Roman military force and the internal contradictions of trying to maintain an independent Hellenistic kingdom in an increasingly Roman-dominated world. The question of how Cleopatra died is ultimately less important than why she died and what her death represented. She died because she stood in the way of Octavian's consolidation of power, because she represented an alternative vision of how the Mediterranean world could be organized, not as a Roman empire centered on Italy but as a Hellenistic empire centered on Alexandria, not as a masculine military culture but as a culture that valued education, philosophy, art, and science, not as a republic in name or an autocracy in fact, but as a divine monarchy in the ancient Egyptian and Ptolemaic tradition. And this alternative vision was intolerable to Roman power. It had to be destroyed, and Cleopatra had to die, and her death had to be framed in a way that discredited not just her but everything she represented. So the Cobra story, whether true or false, served this purpose. It made her death exotic and oriental and feminine and emotional and irrational. Everything that Rome defined itself against, everything that justified Roman conquest and domination. Fast forward 2,000 years, and we're still arguing about Cleopatra, still trying to separate the historical figure from the mythology. still debating whether she was a great ruler or a skilled seductress or both or neither. And the reason we're still arguing is that Cleopatra's story touches on fundamental questions about power, gender, colonialism, and how history is written. The fact that virtually all our sources about her were written by Roman men who had every reason to distort and diminish her achievements tells us something important about whose stories get preserved and whose get erased. The fact that her image has been endlessly reimagined through the centuries tells us something about how each era projects its own anxieties and fantasies onto historical figures, and the fact that we still can't agree on something as basic as how she died tells us something about the limits of historical knowledge and the power of propaganda to shape our understanding of the past. Recent archaeological work in Egypt has brought renewed attention to the search for Cleopatra's tomb. In 2009, Zahi Hawass, Egypt's former Minister of Antiquities, announced that researchers were close to finding it, based on excavations at Taposiris Magna, a temple complex west of Alexandria. Archaeologist Kathleen Martinez has spent years excavating tunnels deep beneath the temple, discovering coins with Cleopatra's image, statues, and elaborate underground chambers. And in 2025, new discoveries of tunnels extending 43 feet underground have generated excitement that the tomb might finally be found. But even if we find Cleopatra's body, even if we can perform modern forensic analysis and determine definitively how she died, would that really change our understanding of who she was and what she represented? The cobra story has become so embedded in our cultural mythology that disproving it might be impossible. Even with physical evidence, we want to believe in the dramatic snake suicide because it fits our narrative expectations, because it makes Cleopatra's death worthy of her legendary life, because it gives us a clear, simple, symbolically resonant ending to her story. But maybe the uncertainty is actually appropriate. Maybe not knowing exactly how Cleopatra died is fitting for a figure who spent her entire life manipulating appearances and controlling narratives, who understood that power comes not just from military force or economic resources, but from how you're perceived, from the stories that are told about you, from the mythology you create around yourself. Cleopatra crafted her public image carefully, styling herself as the goddess Isis, arriving in Tarsus as Venus, presenting herself to Caesar rolled in a carpet. Every action was theater. Every appearance was calculated for maximum effect. So perhaps her death, shrouded in mystery and contradictory accounts, dramatic yet uncertain, symbolic yet ambiguous, is the perfect final act for a woman who lived her entire life performing power. What we can say with certainty is that Cleopatra died on August 12, 30 BCE, at the age of 39 in her palace in Alexandria, that she died rather than become Octavian's prisoner and trophy, that her death marked the end of Ptolemaic Egypt and the beginning of Egypt's incorporation into the Roman Empire, that her children were either killed or scattered and absorbed into other royal families, their potential as heirs to both Egypt and Rome extinguished, that Octavian used her death as propaganda to justify his own seizure of absolute power in Rome, transforming the Republic into an empire with himself as Augustus, and that within a generation, Cleopatra had been transformed from a historical figure into a legend, a cautionary tale, a symbol of exotic foreign seduction and the dangers of Eastern influence, a transformation so complete that we're still living with its effects 2 millennia later. The irony is that Cleopatra probably would have appreciated how her death created her immortality. She understood the power of mythology, the importance of how you're remembered, and while she surely would have preferred to be remembered as the founder of a great dynasty, as the ruler who united East and West, as the woman who almost changed the course of history, being remembered at all, being discussed and debated and reimagined for 2,000 years, being the subject of countless works of art and literature and scholarship, this is its own kind of immortality. This is its own kind of victory, because Octavian, who defeated her militarily, who destroyed her dynasty, who conquered her kingdom, is remembered primarily as the man who defeated Cleopatra. His entire identity is bound up with her story. He's important because she was important. He's interesting because she was fascinating. And in the end, the foreign queen he tried so hard to diminish and destroy has overshadowed him. In cultural memory, She's the one we tell stories about. She's the one who inspires endless fascination. She's the one who feels alive and human and real 2,000 years later, while Augustus feels like a marble statue, cold and distant and forgettable. So whether Cleopatra died from a cobra bite, from poison, or from assassination, whether her death was a carefully planned final act of defiance or a desperate improvisation or a murder disguised as suicide, what matters is that she died refusing to surrender her agency, refusing to become what Octavian wanted her to be, refusing to participate in her own humiliation, and in that refusal, she achieved something more lasting than any military victory. She created a story so powerful, so resonant, so endlessly fascinating that it has survived every attempt to erase or diminish it, and that story, uncertain and contradictory and problematic as it is, tells us something true about power and resistance and the complexity of historical figures who refuse to be reduced to simple narratives. And maybe that's the real answer to the question of what happened the night Cleopatra died. What happened was that a brilliant, calculating, desperate woman, trapped by circumstances beyond her control, facing the destruction of everything she had worked for, made one final choice to control her own fate, to die on her own terms, to deny her enemy complete victory, and in doing so, she ensured that we would still be talking about her 2,000 years later, still trying to understand her, still fascinated by the woman who almost changed everything, and perhaps that's the greatest revenge against conquest, to become so legendary that the conquerors are remembered mainly for having conquered you, to transform military defeat into cultural victory, to die in a way that ensures you'll never be forgotten. And in this sense, Cleopatra won, not the way she wanted, not in her lifetime, not by preserving her dynasty or her kingdom, but by becoming immortal, by becoming a story that can never be fully told, a mystery that can never be completely solved, a woman who 2 millennia after her death still has the power to fascinate, to provoke debate, to challenge our assumptions about power and gender and history, and that power, the power of legend, the power of story, might be the most lasting kind of power there is, because kingdoms fall, empires crumble, monuments decay, but stories endure. Stories shape how we understand ourselves and our world, and Cleopatra's story, whatever the truth about that final night in August of 30 BCE, whatever really killed her in that sealed room with her handmaidens beside her, her story survives, and as long as it survives, so does she, the last pharaoh of Egypt, the queen who defied Rome, the woman who died rather than surrender, the legend who proved that sometimes the greatest victory is simply refusing to be erased from history.